Thank you. Thank you very kindly. Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. This is a new weight loss program we're promoting here at the museum. He lost 150 pounds, but he only weighed 200. Well, it's good to have you all here today. We're going to talk about the skeleton, bones of the body. You know, any part of the body is amazing, isn't it? Here, last week, I talked about the ear and the eye. Fascinating. But even the bones of our body. I give a lecture on skin. I do a whole hour lecture on a hair follicle. So we'll spare you that one right now, but we'll go ahead with this. Well, let's begin with the Word of God. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And the Bible does have something to say about bones. You know, the Bible's not a book of biology, doesn't cover all the organs of the body, anything like that. But it mentions the eye and the ear and lungs and skin and muscles and ligaments and other things. And it does indeed mention bones. For example, Job gave God credit and glorified him for the bones of his body. He started out kind of an interesting comment. He said, "Did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? Clothe me with skin and flesh, and knit me together with bones and sinews." So the sinews would be the ligaments and tendons of the body. And I like that expression, knit me together. Have you run into that before in Scripture? In the Psalms, it mentions the Lord knit us together in our mother's womb. You know, it's intriguing. When I was active in my career at the medical school, I specialized in an area called histology. Anyone here ever hear of that word, histology? Few? Yeah, that's the way I smoke out the nurses, the physicians, and the allied health people. If they've heard the word, they've been around the block a few times. Yeah, histology comes from a Greek word, histos. It means a web or a fabric. So histology is the study of webs and fabrics. You're probably wondering what medical students are doing studying webs and fabrics. That's the name given to looking through a microscope at the human body or some other creature as well. And why would they call looking through the microscope at our body, for example, looking through the microscope at the bones of our body, which we'll do, why do they call that the study of webs and fabrics? Because everything is woven under the microscope. Indeed, bones are woven in a way that's just extraordinary. In fact, under the microscope, our body is so woven, you might actually conclude that we were knit together in our mother's womb, and it's called histology. Well, not just us humans that have bones. In fact, it's not even just living things. I always like to think that buildings themselves have bones. What you're looking at here is a creation museum when it was under construction. A good many years ago, I had a chance to see some of the first spade shovels of dirt moved aside for the museum. And you're looking at some girders here. I call this whole lecture God's girders, because bones are like girders in a building, or girders in a building are like bones. If you look up in the top part there towards the roof of the developing roof, you'll notice that there's some special girders that have sort of little triangles in them. And these little triangular structures, you can see them right in that square area there, are a very special type of girder, or a truss, more accurately. And it's known as a Warren's truss. You've seen it before, I'm sure, in many, many buildings, bridges, railroad trestles, series of triangles, one after another between two parallel bars. And it's said that's the strongest truss that can be made for a given amount of material. That's as good as it gets. By the way, did they tell you there was going to be a test in here? They didn't say a thing. Oh, those rascals, they never do. You know, we teachers don't get paid a whole lot. One of the few joys we have in life is persecuting students with exams. So, and I like trick questions. Here's the question for you. Who designed and invented the Warren's truss? You would think Warren, wouldn't you? Oh, I love failing students. Yeah, I'm going to show you something interesting. You take one of these turkey vultures we've got flying around here, and you look at the wing, the hand makes up part of the wing of the vulture. It would be basically this bone right here that you see in the palm. Okay, we call it the metacarpal bone. Makes up the bones in our palm. The vulture has a bone like that too. Most vertebrates do. And if you take that bone, you kind of saw down the middle and look inside. Let's just take a look inside. You got a good eye on that Warren's truss now? Here comes the inside of a turkey vulture bone. Guess what? Warren's truss, only I don't call it Warren's truss, I call it God's truss. God had designed it 6,000 years before Warren ever got around to coming up with the idea. So that's the way at least the bone looks in a turkey vulture. Well, birds have bones, we have bones, buildings have trusses, all vertebrates have bones, even Watson here, who's a basset hound. He grew to be a pretty good-sized dog, very heavy, kind of hard to lift, but he always had those short legs. That kind of goes with being a basset hound. We might wonder, why is it the legs are so short on a dog like this, where you look at a Dalmatian or something like that, maybe weigh the same amount of weight, but long, long legs. That's one of the things we'll try to touch on here, is what determines how tall we get or how long our legs are or whatever. First thing we might do is introduce you to Yorick here and address the question, how many bones do we have in our body? Well, you'd think we could put a specific number on it, but it's really hard to do because some people can have a few more bones than others due to how many vertebrae might exist in their coccyx or something like that. Also, what do you call separate bone rather than one bone can be difficult when bones fuse together. See, when a baby's born, they have about 270 bones in their body. They're not all bones. Some of them are cartilage. Eventually, most become bone. But as you get older, you get fewer bones. That doesn't make sense, does it? You'd have fewer bones as an adult than you did when you were first born. But a lot of the bones fuse together. For example, look at our hip bone here. This, by the way, is the only bone in the body that doesn't have a name. It's called the innominate. It means no name. No name bone. We call it the hip bone, so we have a name for it, right? And this is really 3 bones fused together. So this would have counted as 3 when a person was first born, when they were young, because this part up here called the ilium, that's the bone under your belt and the hip, and this bone that comes to the front here fuses, called the pubic bones, and then back here the ischial tuberosities. You're sitting on them right now, supporting your weight. Those are 3 different bones that fuse together right in the middle of this socket where the femur goes in. So we'd count 1 today, but count it as 3 when we were first born. So lots of bones in our body. You look at the feet down there, there's 26 bones in the feet, each foot. There's 27 bones in each hand. You have an extra little tiny floating bone. You look at the skull, you have 30 bones, 33 actually, counting jaw and what have you. So lots of bones all fused together here to make this box. If we were going to look at the ribs, 12 of those, 1 for each of the apostles. I've heard people ask the question, do we have 1 less rib than we used to have ever since Adam gave up a rib for Eve? No, that's not the case at all, and you wouldn't think it would be. After all, if a person had an amputation and then several years later gave birth to a child, you wouldn't be missing the arm and the child. So no, ladies and men have all 12 ribs. And they attach to vertebrae in the back, and there's 12 vertebrae called thoracic vertebrae attached to those ribs. So, all creatures that are vertebrates, if they walk, have limbs. Consider the front limb here, the forelimb. This bone's always going to be the humerus. And this is the radius. This is the ulna. The carpal bones in the wrist, other parts that grasp. And evolutionists look at this, it's called homology, that you see the same basic thing whether you're looking at a rat or a cat or a mouse or a dinosaur. Same thing, humerus, radius, and ulna. And they say, well, there you go, that proves we all evolved from a common ancestor. Well, another way you could put the same thing, well, that proves we all have a common creator, kind of the same kind of thinking. But I think it shows something else. Every vertebrate you see, if it has limbs like this, the first joint is a universal joint on its humerus, allows you to do this. The second joint is a hinge joint, only works in this direction, like this. And that's true of every vertebrate you look at. And the next joint, this is really, interesting. It's a rotational joint. See here? It goes like this. Rotates back and forth. Do that with their hand. Now think of it. If you didn't have those joints, you couldn't do what the human arm does. Here's an interesting exercise. Get on the internet tonight and look up a robotic arm. They make them remote control. They can take bombs apart or something. If they explode, you blow up a robotic arm, not you. And every robotic arm you see, the first joint's a universal joint. Second joint's a hinge joint. The next one's rotational, and then a gripper. Now, if you didn't have that, imagine if we had some radioactive material here that we want to pour out over here. We'd go zzz, that was a hinge joint. Zzz, that was a hinge joint plus a universal joint going that way. Then the universal joint goes this way too. Now we pour rotational, rotational, universal, hinge, universal, hinge. You can't do it any other way. How about that for an explanation for homology? It's as good as it gets. So we might ask a question now. What would life be like without bones? I've got a picture to give you a rough idea what it would be like. It would look something like that. You would be a puddle. And I've got news for you. Being a puddle would not be your biggest problem. You'd have bigger problems than being a puddle. Let's just look at the functions of bones. You'll be familiar with some of these. Maybe a couple will be new, but let's just go through it. Bones serve as mechanical support, like you see from that picture. Without that, we couldn't be supported or stand upright. Bones also protect the organs of the body. A good example is the skull. Completely encloses the brain. Nothing can get to it. It's all enclosed by bone, even inside the orbits. Another place with a lot of protection, look at inside that rib cage. If you were in here looking out, you would think you were in jail, wouldn't you? There'd be bars everywhere you looked. What's being protected in there? Right in the midline? The heart. The lungs are in here. The kidneys are located back here. The spleen is right up against the ribs here on the left side. All sorts of things protected by these ribs. So bones have an important protective function. Bones also work as levers, or levers, however you want to pronounce it, to transmit force and movement. And for a lever to work, it has a fulcrum, and the muscle that makes it work has to go across the joint. You know, if you had a muscle that went from here to here, and it contracted, it wouldn't do much, would it? Wouldn't accomplish anything. But consider the biceps muscle. I could rip off my shirt and demonstrate, but we'll spare you that. The biceps muscle is called biceps because it has two heads, bicep, two head. And the two heads hook up here in the shoulder blade. That muscle, its tendon, crosses the shoulder, so that's one joint. Comes down here, crosses the second joint, so the biceps is crossing two joints. And it attaches to the radius right here. In fact, there's a blue spot on here where it attaches. That's what the paint job's all about. The red is supposed to be the origin of the muscle, and the blue is the insertion. What's the difference? The origin is a part that doesn't move usually, and the insertion is the part that moves. So when you contract your biceps, see, this moves down here, but the shoulder doesn't. By the way, where it attaches here, it attaches to our radius. And if we take our palm and go palm down, look what happens to my finger. It gets pulled right into like a ringer. See right there? That explains why when you do push-ups, and I try to avoid them, but when you do pull-ups, they're bad enough like this. Have you tried doing them like this? You see, your arm wants to unwrap because that tendon, when you go from here to here, wraps your bicep halfway around your radius. So levers and force for movement. How about this for importance? Where would you rank this on the importance scale? Bones make blood. How important is blood? The Bible tells us the blood is the life. Emergency room people tell me that if you can keep the blood going, you can keep somebody alive. So blood is made inside of bones. They're hollow inside, at least once they're dead. But in life, that's filled with marrow. And marrow makes the red blood cells and the white blood cells. It makes the platelets. It causes clotting of blood. So, wow, I'd put that up near the top of importance. And then this is just as important as making blood, and you maybe haven't heard of it. Calcium homeostasis. What does that mean? The calcium levels in our body have to be maintained at a very precise level. And I'm so thankful to the Lord He hasn't left that up to us. Because, for example, calcium is important for muscle contraction. It's the signal that causes muscle to contract. If you didn't have any calcium, you couldn't contract your muscles, you'd be all flaccid. If you had too much calcium, they might go into tetany and lock up. Imagine if you had to drink just the right amount of milk to make sure everything worked. So it's all automatic. And if you have low calcium, you really can't change it by more dietary calcium in most cases. It's all controlled automatically, assuming you have enough calcium in your diet. Well, there are bones that do a lot of other things that we don't even think about, that are probably related to what we just mentioned, but did you know bones are involved in hearing? We wouldn't be able to hear without bones. And the 3 bones we use for hearing just happen to be the smallest bones in the body. How small is this little bone right here? See, this one's shaped like a stirrup. That's its name, the stirrup. Latin name is stapes. That weighs 1/10,000th of an ounce, and it's 1/3 of an inch long. That would be the smallest bone in the body. And it's compared to a dime. The other 2 bones aren't very big either, the hammer and the so-called anvil here. Where are those little bones? They're in what's called our middle ear. There are 3 parts to the ear. It gets a little technical, so I won't go into this too much, except to say that we have this outer part that's called the outer ear. Then we have this middle part called the middle ear. I'm not going too fast, am I? No, I didn't think so. And then we have this inner part called the inner ear. And what's interesting is sound is going through 3 different materials. Sound, first of all, is going through air, because we hear things in air. Without air, you couldn't hear a thing. Air molecules are what makes our eardrums wiggle. And air goes into this little eardrum, wiggles that, which wiggles the bones. And then from there, these little bones that you see right in here open up into an oval window attached to this blue colored structure here. And that's called the cochlea, which means snail shell. That looks like a snail shell. And the cells that do the hearing are in there. So you got the picture, sound goes from air, then it goes through bone, then it goes through basically water. You see, those hearing cells have to be in a nice warm fluid that has the right pH, the right osmotic properties, certain proteins. If you don't do that, these cells die. You take them out and expose them to air, they would be dead. So sound has to go from air to water. And there's a problem when sound goes from air to water. You ever been underwater at the swimming pool or the lake and have somebody try to talk to you that's out of the water? You can't hear a thing. And the reason for that is 99.9% of the sound energy reflects off the water. 1/10% goes in. And those little bones in the middle ear solve that problem of that so-called impedance mismatch. By going through from air through these little bones and then into the water, we don't lose the signal loss. Hey, how's dumb luck working for you so far in this whole thing? So those little bones in the body, they're kind of intriguing. They're the only bones in your body that don't grow after you're born. All the rest of our bones get bigger, but not those little ones in the ear. They stay the same size. Also, they're the only bones in the body that are solid all the way through. All the other bones have at least some marrow space. Well, this is what a skeleton looks like. It's an artist's conception in a fetus. And if you look carefully at all of the joints, we have cartilage. Most of the bones of the body, the vast majority, begin as cartilage. And the cartilage doesn't then turn into bone later. The cartilage gets replaced by bone. So This production of bone begins in a human embryo, at about 6 weeks. And really, the process isn't complete until about the age of 21 years old or so, because there's still bones that are fusing and cartilage being replaced that late. So what's the advantage of having cartilage first? Well, cartilage is rubbery. I guess you can't break it. Also, cartilage is stretchy. So cartilage can grow on the inside, like the way our cells divide in the inside and we can get bigger. Cartilage can grow on the inside as well as at the surface, whereas bone can only grow at the surface. We call that appositional growth. That's the way a tree grows, right? Just grows under the bark. You can't make an oak tree grow from the inside. It grows under the bark at the surface. Same with bone. It grows under the bark, only we don't call it bark. We call it the periosteum, or the endosteum if it's inside. So start with cartilage, become bone. Well, there's 2 components of bone. This should make it easy. Really 2 basic ingredients. One's called the organic matrix, and it makes up about 30% of the weight of a bone that's been dried out. So you find a bone that's dry out in the desert or something, 30% of that weight is what we call the organic matrix. And what is that? It's basically collagen. Leather is collagen. Just take a look at your wallet. You're looking at collagen from the dermis of a cow, probably. And so 30% of a bone is leather. Leather fibers, real fine microscopic fibers. And most of that's collagen. There are some other components as well. And then there's the inorganic matrix. That makes up most of the weight of bone. That's the mineral. You see, everybody thinks organic means healthy food or something. Organic means carbon containing. That's what the word literally means. So things we eat that contain carbon are organic. That would be all sugars, fats, proteins, what have you. About the only thing you eat that doesn't contain carbon is like table salt. Everything else is organic. The inorganic materials make up 70% of the dry weight of the bone, and inorganic materials are typically minerals and salts. And so you know there's a lot of calcium and other minerals that are in our bones. And the most common mineral in our bone is this one right down here. It's called hydroxyapatite. Now, if you want to know what hydroxyapatite's like, consider the enamel on your teeth. That's almost 100% hydroxyapatite. There's almost no organic material there at all. And that's why when you get a hole in your enamel from a bacterium digesting some enamel, it will never heal. You have to drill it out and fill it in with cement. That's it. So you might think this way about the enamel of your teeth. It's the one part of your body that is completely fossilized while you're alive. So if somebody calls you an old fossil, sometimes it's at least true of our teeth, okay? Hydroxyapatite, hardest material known, but combined with this organic material, it takes on new properties. We'll talk about that. Well, just like there's 2 components in bone, these 2 components, when they're put together, form what's called a composite material. Now, composites are interesting. People design composites all the time. They become strong usually when you make a composite. A good example is fiberglass. Fiberglass, if you're familiar with making a fiberglass hull for a boat, you have 2 components. You have the fiberglass fiber, or the glass fiber, looks like glass wool. And then you have a liquid, it's a resin, the liquid fiberglass. And you put the 2 together, and that wool blends with that liquid, and you get a really strong hull. Now, if you made the boat hull just out of the fiberglass fibers, it would sink like a rock. And if you just made it out of the resin and left the fibers out, it would be very hard but brittle, it would break. But the 2 together make it very strong, a composite. Another example of composite is a radial ply tire. You have rubber plus all those nylon cords and everything. If you made the tire out of nylon, it would leak. If you made it out of rubber, it would break in the first bump. Put the rubber and the nylon together, composites. Here's an example of a composite right here. Rebar, metal bars that are in concrete. If you made the bridge out of concrete and left the metal bars out, the truck would go over it, crunch. If you made the bridge out of the rebar, the metal bars, and left the concrete out, the truck would go over the bridge and bend. Put the two together, you get something very special, a composite material. One more composite that's really pretty famous in the Bible, and that's making brick. This is a picture of some rural Romanian citizens making brick, putting them in little square frames, and they mix clay with straw. You probably heard that. They make brick by putting straw in the clay. Why is that? If you make the brick out of the clay and harden it, it makes a brittle brick, not great for making a building. Whereas if you make the brick out of straw and leave the clay out, well, you've heard the story of the three little pigs. We don't have to go through that again. Yeah, that doesn't work. But you mix the straw and the clay together, and it makes a much harder, durable brick. Now that brings in the children of Israel. Remember when they were in Egypt, Pharaoh put them to the task of making bricks. And he figured out what was the limit of human endurance. And that's the quota he gave them. You just couldn't go beyond this. And then when he really wanted to get rid of them, have them die off, he came up with another plan. He says, okay, I'll tell you what. We're going to keep the same quota of brick, except we're not bringing you the straw anymore. You have to go out and get your own straw, bring it back, make the brick, but keep the same quota. Wasn't possible. We look at Exodus chapter 5, verse 16, and we read the children of Israel crying out to God and to Moses, there is no straw given to your servants, and they say to us, make brick. Well, that was the whole basis for the Exodus and much of what follows in Scripture, and it's all related to composite materials. Isn't that interesting? Well, there's two types of cells in bone. You see, bone is not so difficult to understand. Two materials, organic and inorganic, and two cell types that are really important. The first one is called an osteoblast. Osteo means bone, and blast usually means a maker, something that makes something. Erythroblasts make blood cells, turn into blood cells. Osteoblasts make bone. And they secrete an organic bone matrix, which has an affinity for calcium in the tissue fluids, just like you can sometimes get calcium deposits in your kidneys, kidney stones. No fun. But you want that to happen in bones, otherwise it'd be soft. So the osteoblasts secrete a material called osteoid. It's like soft plaster at first, and then minerals enter it. The other cell type's called an osteoclast. Now that's a really interesting one. Clast means eater or breaker. Remember the iconoclasts in Reformation. They thought that there shouldn't be any artwork or stained glass windows or icons in the church, so these wonderful people went around destroying all the artwork in the church. They were called iconoclasts. Well, we have osteoclasts. So you got the picture, you have a cell that makes bone, and another one that comes along and gets rid of it. Well, that seems like a dangerous thing to do. But see, bone is mineral, and it's very hard. And if you're going to have it change shape during life, respond to different loads, you have to be able to remove some bone and add some bone. My femur used to be probably the diameter of a lead pencil when I was first born. Now it's about this round. Bone was added to the surface, but the marrow space would have remained tiny if we didn't have cells to drill it out. So, osteoblasts and osteoclasts. This is what they look like in the microscope. Those two cells over there, and you see others, they're the osteoblasts. They lay down this kind of soft osteoid on the surface of bone or whatever, and then it hardens up when mineral goes into it. This bigger cell over here is called the osteoclast, and that's just taking a chew out of the bone. You can see right here, they took a little chew right out here. And those two work together in concert. Do you realize every year, 20% of all your bone has been replaced, has been removed and put back again? In fact, your epidermis is turning over on the surface of your skin here in 1 month. If we don't see one another for a month, the epidermis is all new. Everything you see on the surface is brand new. Realize what this means? This means that even though I'm only 38, okay, 81 if you must, I'm no older than probably anyone I see in a room here today, because my epidermis is no older, right? A month. In 5 years, your bones have turned over completely at least once. The lining of your GI tract turns over in 4 days, the fastest turnover of anything in the body. The outer segments of the rods and cones in your retina turn over in a week. Your red blood cells turn over in 120 days. Your white blood cells turn over in a week or two. It's estimated that in 15 years, at least, everything in your body has been turned over once. You know what that means? I'm 15. In a sense, it's true, isn't it? In a sense, it's true. But when it turns over, it doesn't turn over right. My skin's no older than the youngest person I can see out there right now. But if I pull up a pinch of skin, you may want to try this little experiment. Hold your hand like that. And get a pinching finger and get some pinch of skin right on the back here, okay? When I count to 3, let go, and see how long it takes that fold of skin to go down. 1, 2, 3. The younger people will be like a thousandth of a second. You want to see something so sad, it's just going to cause the tears to well up in your eyes. You get to be an 81-year-old cat like me. Can you focus in on this? You pull up a piece of skin like this, count to 3, 1, 2, 3, and let go. It just stays there. People say, how long will it stay like that? You going to be around next week at all? People say, you mean you put this pleat in your skin to make some point to the audience, and now for the rest of your life, you're going to have that pleat? No, you see, I get up in the morning, I'm full of wrinkles like this. I just straighten them out, and I'm ready for the day. Okay, so yeah, we're turning over all the time. We don't get any older. So when people ask me, do you really believe Methuselah lived to be 1,000 years old? I tell them, you know, I heard Methuselah died. What a pity, such a young man. 15, it was a tragedy. But the mutations, all the things that go wrong, ever since the fall, just hasn't been right. Boy, I can't wait for the Lord to restore everything, make everything new again. But if he wants to come this weekend, I don't have any plans I can't change. Well, this is how bone grows. And it kind of start at the left and go to the right here. So it starts out small, they get bigger in time. The white little bone way over in the left here, that's basically all cartilage. So most of the bones in your body were cartilage, just like you have in your nose and your ear, flexible. And they could grow from the inside as well as at the surface. And they were pretty much unbreakable, and they require no blood supply. Cartilage is one tissue in your body that is completely anaerobic. It can't stand blood. Actually, it has chemicals that chase blood vessels away. But at some point, you get what's called a bone collar. It looks like a little napkin ring that wraps around the center of the bone. And when that happens, it changes the environment in the bone, or the cartilage bone, completely. And a blood vessel will penetrate in. Here you can see the blood vessel penetrating right here, and we call that the primary center of ossification. In other words, right in the middle of the bone is where the bone starts developing. The rest is still all cartilage. A little later, you'll get a secondary center. Here it is getting larger. It develops in the cartilage that's at each end of the bone until you have it at both ends. Those are the secondary centers. Now here's the thing that's clever. It leaves a little plate of cartilage between the end of the bone and the shaft of the bone, and it leaves a coating of cartilage around the end. The coating around the end is going to be the articular cartilage, your joint. I mean, if you had bone against bone, it would make audible scraping noises when you moved your arms and legs. But it's a nice, smooth, polished cartilage with a lubricant in a joint that's sealed that allows us, you don't hear any noise at all, do you? Isn't that amazing? No noise. So thanks to those cartilage ends, and that cartilage has been there from the get-go, from back when the bone first developed in the embryo. You just have to keep a layer on the end for the joint. And then what's this layer right in here? That's called the growth plate. And as long as you have that growth plate and you have growth hormone, that bone can grow in length. Otherwise, it can't grow in length. Think about it. Let's say this was a bone, and we want it to grow longer. You can't add bone on the ends. What happens if you plop some bone on each end of this long bone? You'd ruin the joint. Well, how's it going to grow in length if you can't add anything to the ends? I'm glad you asked. It's the growth plate. The cartilage can grow because it stretches. You say, well, that's no good. The cartilage gets nice and thick and the bone will just bend over. Yeah, that can happen. It's called rickets. Or you can make the organic material, you just can't mineralize it. But what happens as this cartilage growth plate tries to get thicker by cells dividing, at the bottom end here going towards the middle of the bone, it's replaced by bone. So it never gets thicker, but the bone gets longer because the cartilage quickly gets replaced by bone as it grows. So the combination of growth hormone plus growth plates allows a dog to get long legs or short legs depending on how long those two are available, the growth plate and the hormone. So we get blood vessels that enter the ends of the bone up here as well as ones that enter in the middle. And this is pretty much then what a mature bone looks like. All the cartilage is eventually gone. This shows you one of the problems in the bone growing in length. Here's the end of a bone that's got kind of an expanded end like a lot of bones do. You can see cartilage on the surface. This is joint cartilage. This is the growth plate across the middle here. As that growth plate grows, it gets replaced by bone, and the bone, notice, can increase in length. But look what else has to happen. What about the bone that was in here where you see the blue line? That had to be removed. That's what the osteoclast does. It removes the material that otherwise would have filled the interior. And then you have to add some bone out here, remove a little bone here, and so osteoblasts and osteoclasts are working together in concert. When you're young and growing, the osteoblasts work faster than the osteoclasts, so you get bigger. When you get full grown and the growth plate shut down, osteoblasts and osteoclasts take turns. Remove some bone, put it back, remove it, put it back, and you don't get any bigger. You might think that's really a stupid idea. Once you have the bone, leave it alone. Well, there's a good reason it's being removed. Just like every other part of your body, it has to be turned over. Has to be constantly turned over to repair little microfractures that occur. This probably wasn't true before the fall. I don't suppose we had. You know, the children of Israel wandered 40 years in the desert. Their clothes didn't wear out. Their shoes didn't wear out. If God says something's not going to wear out, it's over. Forget about it. But once we get into the fall, things have to be replaced all the time. And even when they're replaced, as you can see in the skin, it's still young, but it's not the same flexibility. It's not the same. Well, this is a drawing of a human foot of a stillborn baby that was developing in the womb. And all of the bones back here, the small bones of the foot and the ankle and the heel, they would be cartilage yet at this stage, where out here we're starting to make bone. You can see a marrow space inside. And so we have both cartilage and bone at the same time. Now, I'll show you a picture taken of a foot just like this of one of the small bones in the toe, like right here. And the blue is cartilage. And notice no blood vessels in it. It's just homogeneous. This is all cartilage. Here's the joint space between a couple of the bones of the finger. There would be a lubricant in here, and that would be sealed. And here's another joint space. We want to make sure that that last bit of cartilage is retained. That gives us our cartilage joint. Here's our primary center of ossification or bone formation. Notice, unlike cartilage, it stains differently, but it's full of holes like Swiss cheese. That's where the blood vessels are. Bone needs lots of blood. Cartilage can't stand any of it. So it's easy to tell bone and cartilage. So later, a secondary center will form on both sides. This is what a bone in the metatarsal bone in the sort of this part of the foot of a human stillborn baby looks like. Both ends are blue cartilage. We don't show you all the way to the end. This is the shaft of the bone. Remember, it's cut in section. And marrow is beginning to form in here. And we can see lots of holes where the blood vessels run in this area. Well, here you can see what cartilage really does for us in the joint. This is where our femur and tibia might meet, right at the knee. This is the kneecap over here. Even the kneecap has a cartilage articulating surface on it, so it slips smoothly over these bones. The femur has cartilage, about the thickness of a dime or a little thicker, and the tibia has cartilage. Now, a person that weighs maybe a couple 100 pounds goes out jogging. Every time their heel hits the ground, they say there's about 600 pounds of force right here at the hip. And that's cartilage in the end of that bone of the femur, and the cup that it fits in, that's cartilage. 600 pounds of force pushing on a layer of rubbery material about the thickness of a dime. If it had blood vessels in it, what would happen to the blood vessels? They'd be squeezed flat on a pancake. That'd be the end of that joint. But praise be to God, those joints are avascular, at least the cartilage part is, not the rest of the bone. So squeeze away. In fact, when you squeeze, it causes the lubricant to recycle in the joint, just like getting a lube job. Isn't that great? We don't have any grease zerks. We have to go out here and lube. Well, let's take a little closer look where you see that blue box. We're going to actually look at the cartilage joint of a bone and the microscope. And this is what it looks like. This would be the joint space up on top here. The lubricant is. This is the cartilage. It's light, no blood vessels. That's the cartilage. And down here, staining red, mainly because it has so much collagen in it. It's the collagen that's staining. And it's full of holes like Swiss cheese, typical of bone, highly vascularized. Now this is the end of our tibia going into our ankle. So this is the ankle right in here. And in an x-ray, it looks like this bone, the tibia, is fractured. You notice that gap? This is a growing person. That's the growth plate, that's cartilage. And even the fibula over here has a little growth plate. So that little plate right there, called the epiphyseal plate, or common name is the growth plate, is what allows us to grow in length. If we have growth hormone plus that plate, we get taller and taller. Once you don't have the growth hormone and or you don't have the cartilage, you can't get any taller. If you don't have that cartilage growth plate and you do have growth hormone, you still don't get taller. The other cartilages of your body get bigger. It's a disease called acromegaly. So your nose gets bigger, your ears get bigger, your chest gets bigger because of the cartilage on the end of the ribs. But you can't get any taller. You can't get any taller. Your fingers can't get any longer. So over to the right there, this is that cartilage growth plate. The cells divide very quickly here. Then down here, they start to break down, and bone cells set on top of this calcified cartilage. And it's sort of like putting plaster on lath work or screen. It holds it in place till it hardens up. Well, this is a human femur at the distal end near the knee. And here you can see very nicely, it's been sawed down its length. Where the growth plate used to be, it used to be right in here. But now it's bone. And because it's bone, it wouldn't respond to growth hormone today. It's not able to. I put this little picture on the side to show you what this bone is doing for a living right here. We call this spongy bone. Doesn't it look like sponge? It's a good name for it, spongy bone, as opposed to compact bone down here. So bone is tubular, which tubes are very strong, but inside is the spongy bone. And that spongy bone gives us a lot of strength while keeping the weight of the bone down. Years ago, I bought the whole set of Encyclopedia Britannica for my family. And I put up a couple of cinder blocks on each side to make a bookcase and put a plank across it. And I piled all my books on top of that plank, and this is basically what happened. The plank just bent. But I solved the problem. How? I cut off one more piece of the same stock from the plank and put it in the middle vertically. And now you can pile all the books on you want. That's the principle of spongy bone, having these beams going perpendicular to the surface. In fact, they're oriented and can change their orientation with time. Let's look a little higher power. Here you can see where the growth plate used to be, right in here. We'll mark it off for you. These little beams of bone are not fixed. They're turning over. They're being dissolved and replaced. And when a lady becomes pregnant and has 20 pounds of weight here she didn't have before, the bones of her hips and her legs all remodel. All those little beams reset their direction of orientation to best accommodate the forces brought to bear. Or if you had a stone in one shoe and you were silly enough to leave it there, so that then you had to walk like this because of the stone in the shoe, the bones of your legs would remodel to best accommodate the way you're using them. And if you don't use your bones at all, like you go out into space and you float around weightless for a few months, bone density goes way down. Bone wants to be used. It wants to be under load. And if it isn't, it loses its mass, its dynamic. How does it know to add more bone to increase its strength or point in a different direction? It's been shown experimentally that even a dead bone, if you take a piece of it and bend it, it generates an electric current. Those of you old enough to remember record players? Remember the first cartridges for the record player were called ceramic cartridges. The needle went up into a little ceramic thing, which is a crystal, and when the needle wiggled, it bent the crystal, and that's called a piezoelectric. When the crystal's bent, it generates electric current. That's what's going on in the bone. When bone is bent or forces, it generates piezoelectric currents that are believed to be involved with possibly recruiting the bone-making cells and the bone dissolving cells. Hey, how's dumb luck working for you on bone so far? Well, there's the femur. You all recognize that. Has the neck of the femur up here. When you hear people falling and breaking their hip, they're usually just breaking the neck of the femur. In fact, probably as often as any, they're breaking their femur and then falling, not falling and breaking their femur. Because particularly in women, as you get older, osteoporosis can set in. And particularly if you've had a lot of bed rest and are underweight, that reduces bone density. So lifting weights would help. There are other ways of doing it too. But look at the way the spongy bone is arranged in here. You see how they kind of crisscross through here? This makes this bone very strong, and the fellow who designed the Eiffel Tower in Paris used the architecture of the femur to produce these intersecting crossing beams. And let's just look at this part of the femur right here. Notice we're getting a bit of the compact bone on the edge and the spongy bone in the middle. I took this picture of a human bone when I was still at the medical school. And boy, is that gorgeous, the things going on there at a microscope level. In life, that would be filled in with fat and marrow. But now the fat and marrow is gone, so we can see these marvelous little beams. And these beams can change their direction and orientation depending on the forces brought to bear. And then down here, we call that compact bone. Boy, that's obvious. It's spongy bone, compact bone. And the compact bone, you wonder, how do you get blood vessels in there? It looks like it's solid. We know bone has to have lots of blood vessels. Well, here's a model of the way compact bone is put together. And boy, I hope you got your seat belts on out there because you're going to go for a ride on this one. This is the marrow space over here. This is the outside of the bone here. We call this the periosteum, the covering that covers over the bone. There's a covering in here called the endosteum. And in the middle, we have the compact bone. And notice compact bone is made up of a number of cylinders that are closely packed. These cylinders measure about 0.2 of a millimeter in diameter. Now that happens to be the limit of the resolution of the human eye. A millimeter is the thickness of a dime. So 0.2 of a millimeter is 0.2 the thickness of a dime. That's the diameter of these cylinders. They're right at the limit of the resolution of the eye. So this is showing how they might be dissected out to show the parts. And notice here you can see the little holes where the cells were. There's several layers of cells. The blood vessel runs in the middle of these cylinders. These cylinders are called osteons. And over here, they're showing you how the collagen fibers, it looks like a worm gear, how the collagen fibers in each layer are running in a different direction, so it's like plywood. It gives you strength. If you don't have this architecture, bone does not have the same strength. What is the strength of bone when it's put together like this? Pound for pound, bone is as strong as cast iron. And it's alive. and it's changing dynamically as you use it. Well, let's kind of look down from the top here. Here are these osteons. This is one right here. Once in a while, you get a vessel that goes across to the neighbor, but mostly they run inside like that. And notice that each of these has several layers. Now, how did we get those little cylindrical structures? Remember the osteoclast that can remove bone? It's like a drill bit. It drills a hole right down into the bone, several millimeters in length. And it can drill fast enough that it takes 100 osteoblasts to keep up with one osteoclast. When the hole is drilled, and it could be drilled anywhere, for example, one might come along today and make a hole right here. A blood vessel will drop into that hole. It'll bring bone-producing cells with it. These cells will line the wall of this long cylindrical hole and produce bone from the edge in. We call that centripetally. And they stop short of getting to the blood vessel. And this is how you get these concentric layers. Let's look at an area about like that, only in real bone, under the microscope. Right here's where the blood vessel would normally be. These are the osteocytes that get buried as bone is produced. They get trapped, sort of like flies in ointment. You might wonder, how do you manage to stay alive if you've just gotten yourself buried in concrete? Well, it's interesting. You watch the old cowboy movies. I used to watch them at the junior high before television. There was always some guy running from a posse or somebody who would go down to the river, get a straw, go underwater, and breathe through the straw. You've seen that, haven't you? That's the way these things work. These cells have hundreds of little straws called canaliculi. These little canals go from lacuna to lacunae, and the cells have little processes. And these processes go out and meet the processes of their neighbors. And so nutrients can be passed from the area around the blood vessel to this cell, which can pass it to this one, which can pass it to this one, all the way out to the edge of the osteon, all hooked together by these tiny little holes called canaliculi in the bone. Let's look at just one of those little holes where a bone cell would reside, and look at it in the scanning electron microscope. This is a picture I took about 1 million years ago, as I recall. Here's one of these osteocytes sitting right in the lacunae. This straw pile out here represents the collagen fibers and the mineral. And the collagen fibers and the mineral aren't just sort of thrown together randomly. They are intimately combined down at the molecular level to give the strength. And you can see some of the processes of the osteocyte going out to its neighbor here. Well, let's get to the tail end of my lecture, so let's talk about the tailbone. How many people have fallen on your tailbone? If you notice this, when you fall on your tailbone, there's 3 positions you cannot bear to be in: standing, sitting, and laying down. Those 3 positions, too painful. And why is that? It's because you have so many muscles attached to that little piece of bony real estate coming from so many different directions that it's being pulled all the time. And that makes it painful. Now, the evolutionists say that's our vestigial tail. You've heard this, haven't you? We all have a tail. It's right here. Show it for you. This is supposed to be the tail right here. What it is a group of about 4 vertebrae that are fused together, just like here in the sacrum. You have 5 vertebrae fused together. Here there's about 4, and there's a little joint that allows it to flex. Is that a little ending left over from our tail? Look at it this way. The vertebral column is a linear structure, right? And a linear structure has how many ends? 2. But what if you cut it, like think of a rope now, linear structure, 2 ends. What if you cut off one of the 2 ends? Then how many ends do you have? 2. You cannot have less than 2 ends on a linear structure. The vertebral column and its spinal cord is a linear structure. There's a head on one end, and the other end has to end somewhere. Would you agree? Somewhere. And wherever it ends, there will be an evolutionist pointing saying, aha, a tail. What are the alternatives? There aren't any. It's not a tail. It's a highly useful piece of bony real estate. In fact, if I were to rank order the bones in the body on how useful and important they are based on how many muscles attach from how many different directions, that little rascal, I think, would win. Let's take a look at it. This is a pelvis of a lady. How can we tell? It's cylindrical. Right in here, it's open and cylindrical. In a male, it's more conical. So trying to get a baby through a male pelvis would be like trying to push a baby's head through a funnel. It just wouldn't work. But the lady has more of a cylindrical pelvis. Plus these joints here and here and here, right at the time of childbirth, soften up and allow the pelvis to expand. They don't dissolve altogether, or you'd have 3 different parts of the pelvis. That would not work. But they open up just enough, and the baby's head still doesn't fit. It has to be turned 90 degrees, so the long axis is this way, and it just fits. But what about that little tailbone right there? What does that do? I'm going to show you some of the muscles that attach to that bone. There they are in red. They're called the pelvic diaphragm. What that is a muscular bowl right about here. And what sits on that bowl? Your bladder, which would be, your bladder, the uterus, the sigmoid colon. All of these things are sitting on top of this. And if you didn't have that, if that whole diaphragm were missing, the first time you went like this, whoopee, things would really go right on through. So let's look at the muscles that are causing this pelvic floor to be produced. There's the coccyx or tailbone. These 2 muscles are called the pubococcygeus muscles. They go from the pubic to the coccyx. 2 more coming in from the side are called the iliococcygeus, come from the ilium bones on the side into the coccyx. And then there's 2 more called the coccygeus muscles. These, together with a few more I'm not naming, make up the whole pelvic diaphragm. Note that the anus, vagina, and urethra have to pass through this pelvic diaphragm. And at childbirth, this opening right here has to be distended to this size to allow the baby's head through. No wonder it's painful. So the pelvic diaphragm is an extremely important structure. Well, I think the tail's a good place to end, and I'd like to end with a few comments from the scripture about bones, because there's a lot of gospel in the bones when the Lord works with it. Psalm chapter 6, verse 2. Lord, have mercy on me, O Lord, for I am weak. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are troubled. Ever get to the point you feel your very bones are troubled and aching? The Lord heals our troubled bones by taking on a lot of trouble in his own bones. Psalm 22, verse 14, is a fascinating account of the very thoughts of Jesus Christ on the cross. You know, when Handel wrote Handel's Messiah, 2/3 of this piece of music that's all taken from King James Bible about the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, 2/3 comes from the Old Testament, because it's speaking more clearly about some of the events and in more detail than we get in the New. And here in the Old Testament are the very thoughts of Christ. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. Hanging on the cross, his bones were just pulled out of joint. And Jesus went on to say in Psalm 22:17, I can count all my bones. They hurt that much, every one he could feel. And the people around stood and stared at him. Some mocked. We go to the New Testament in John 19, verse 36, and we read, for these things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled, that although Christ's bones were pulled apart at their joints, and although they ached, all the way from Old Testament time, we knew that not one of his bones shall be broken. And even today, when Jews celebrate the Passover, you are not permitted to break so much as a single bone of the Paschal Lamb. Thanks be to God that he allowed his bones to be pulled out of joint, to be mocked, crucified, raised again from the dead, and save us from sin, death, and the power of Satan. Thank you.